Hey, Insane Sam Allen here. You know, I've been riding motorcycles for about 25 years, and I ride over 20,000 miles most years, but I wasn't always that way. I didn't get my motorcycle till I was well into my 40s, and I had a great time meeting a guy named David Cook who I bought it from, and this guy was so hilarious I thought you'd like some stories about him. I used to practice law in a big law firm in Houston, and one day I was kind of burned out, so I got in my car, and I was driving around the 610 loop, and I saw a giant billboard that said Mancuso Harley-Davidson. I thought to myself, you know, I can afford one of those. So I called up a chick named Sue Daly, who was the only person I knew who owned a motorcycle, and asked her about him. And she introduced me to David Cook. I wound up buying a Road King from the guy the next day. Hanging around David Cook turned out to be living live in an Elmore Leonard novel. His friends were unbelievable. There was a guy named Gene who was a gigolo. He was always hanging up with older women, taking a lot of money from them. One of them bought him a Prevost bus. Then there was a guy named DC who ran a biker bar. A guy 65 years old, had a great bar, winds up going to jail for selling dope. Then there was a guy named Charlie. Charlie had a flooring company, very prosperous, except it was a front for his bookmaking business. And so those were the kinds of people we hung around. But David was an interesting guy, and what he did is he ran a place called Luxury Cycles. And that was a place where you'd get custom motorcycle work done and stuff like that. What David was really good at was selling. You know, if you took your motorcycle in to get an oil change, you might get $300 worth of parts that you didn't order on there. And he'd just say, hey, I knew you wanted the parts, so we put them on anyway. He charged you. You never complained. You needed a state inspection? No problem. He bought a sticker from the guy across the street. Your bike would never get inspected, but you'd have a sticker. The guy would sell you these passes. He had a whole package. In there you'd get a press pass, you'd get a fake state insurance card, you'd get an authentic handicapped driver card, thing that you hang on your mirror. You got a thing that said you were an ordained minister. You got all this stuff for that from David. $150, you got all that stuff. One time we were going to a baseball game. We pull in, David flashes his press pass, zips on into the Astrodome parking lot. We park right up front, put his handicap thing on there, flash the press pass, get into the Astrodome, go up to the press box, drink their beer, eat their food, and watch the game. It was a great time. And David was just that kind of guy. He had a guy named Chris Carmody who came in to get his head stubbed on his motorcycle. When you get your head stubbed, what they do is they take the engine heads off and they machine them in and they fill it in so it looks like a little bitty bathtub in there. And what that causes is more compression in the cylinders and you're supposed to get to go faster. So that's about a $2,000 job. Chris takes his bike in, David takes the heads off, ships the heads out to the guy who does the machine work, comes back 2 weeks later, puts the heads back on, gives Carmody his bike back. Carmody's thrilled to have his bike back and David even gave him a discount. Well, and Carmody would tell you how great the bike ran. He said it never ran faster, especially through second, third gears. Loved the deal. Well, a year later, he was having a little problem with his bike, so he took it into Mancuso Harley-Davidson. He said, you know, I think the problem is I got engine trouble because I'm getting too much compression because I had the heads tubbed. Well, they take the heads off the bike and they say, wait, man, your heads are the same as any other stock bike. Cook had charged him for the deal without even having the work done. One of the funniest stories ever with David Cook was the Fat Boy he sold me. He had this beautiful Fat Boy in his shop that he was trying to sell for $25,000, and this bike was worth it. It was a beautiful motorcycle. It had a great purple paint job that if the sun hit it just right, a wolf's head would come out and his eyes would blaze in the sunlight, but when the sun wasn't on it, it just looked like a black cherry-colored bike. Great motorcycle. Well, one day David and me and a bunch of guys, we all decided to rent a limo so we could go out drinking and raising hell and stuff. We were so rowdy that the cops pulled us over in the limo and almost arrested us all, even though we were in a limo. But Cook talked the cop out of arresting us, and on we went. Well, that night, Cook says, hey, Sammy, you know that Fat Boy I got? I'll sell it to you for $20,500, but you got to buy it by noon tomorrow. The light goes on. For sure, David wound up not owning the bike. David got to keep everything over $20,000 that he sold it for, and David needed $500. So I said, okay, David, I'll buy the bike. So I wake up the next morning, I'm hungover as hell. Phone rings, it's David. "Hey, Sammy, when are you going to come over and pick up your fat boy?" I said, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "Don't you remember? You said you're going to buy the fat boy, man, $20,500. I go, "Oh, yeah, okay, I'll come over and get it." I go to the bank, I get a cashier's check, and give it to David. David says, "Great, Sammy, here are the keys. I'll get you your title tomorrow." No problem. I go driving off on this beautiful fat boy. Well, a few weeks go by, I don't have the title. 6 months go by, I don't have the title. I really didn't care because I had the bike. But it was getting time to, do the registration deal, and I was afraid if I didn't have a title, they wouldn't let me re-register the thing. So I called up the Department of Transportation, whoever they are in Texas, gave them the VIN number of the motorcycle, and they told me a guy named David Osuch owned the bike. Well, I look up in the phone book, and sure enough, there's a guy named David Osuch. I call him up. "Hey, David, you and I got a great common friend." "Yeah, who's that?" "David Cook." "Oh, yeah, Cook's a great guy. I love Cook." I said, "Well, David, I'm the guy who bought your fat boy, and I still don't have the title." And Osuch says, "Well, yeah, he still owes me 10 grand on the bike." Well, I knew that's what had happened for sure, and I just started laughing. So Osuch tells me that Cook gave him 10 grand when he first sold me the bike and told him that I had all my assets tied up in limited partnerships over in London, and it's going to be 60 days before I could give him the other 10 grand. Well, the 60 days went by. Osuch calls up looking for his other 10 grand. He says, "You're not going to believe what happened. The DEA came and arrested this guy. They took all his assets, including the motorcycle. They arrested him for selling drugs, and he's in jail now for being a drug dealer." That's supposed to be me, the drug dealer. So, we're both just laughing our asses off on this. Well, I went to see Cook that night. I knew right where he'd be. I figured he'd be over at Floyd's Bar, which is where we always used to go. Floyd's Cajun Shack had a good bar over there. So there's Cook, drinking VO and Coke, having a big old time. "Hey, David, guess who I talked to today?" "Who's that, Sambo?" "I talked to David Osuch." "Great guy. I love David Osuch." I said, "Yeah, he tells me I don't have the title to my fat boy because you still owe him 10 grand on the bike." David didn't miss a blink. He goes, "He's absolutely right." And he starts telling me this story. And I just kind of stood there and stared at him. And David finally said, put his hand on my shoulder, says, "Sambo, you want your title, don't you?" I said, "Yeah, I do, David." Next day, he showed up with the title. He just swindled somebody else out of 10 grand, and kind of a rotating swindle going around. But the guy was even funnier. I mean, David's probably 62 or 63 at this time. He gets pulled over for drunk driving about 3 in the morning. Cop pulls him over and says, "What's an old man like you out here drinking like this in the middle of the night?" David says, "I'm on my paper route, man." Well, David calls me from the jail the next day. Got to go bail him out. And while he was in jail, he tells me, they came around with the bologna sandwiches. They handed me my sandwich. I said, "Hey, you got any Grey Poupon?" Well, anyway, we bailed David out. And he got fined a bunch of money. And they put one of these breathalyzers on his truck, so he couldn't start the truck without breathing into the tube. So David would go out drinking, and he'd have so much alcohol in his blood the next morning he couldn't start his truck. So I'd have to go over and meet him and blow into this tube. And you didn't just blow in. You had to make like this humming noise. You had to go, woo, woo. So I'd go there and blow into it, and the car would start up. But the cops were smart about this deal. You got to blow back into it another 45 minutes later. So I'd have to go driving around town with David, waiting for the beeper to come off to breathe into the tube again. And then we'd be going down the highway. I'm going down, looks like I'm going down on him, going on the highway, woo, woo, blowing into this thing. The thing would keep going, and then he'd be good for the rest of the day. You just can't make this stuff up about this guy. Well, David was a great, great friend. He literally was a professional swindler. But he got pancreatic cancer toward the end of his life, and I'm not going to tell all those stories, but he was himself to the end. Well, we went to his funeral, and they really didn't have a regular funeral. They had it at a bar called, it's now called the Saltgrass. It used to be called something else. I forget what it was called. The Hofbrau is what it was called before. It was a place where he hung around a lot. So I'm standing there with David's son, Ricky, and a guy named Brett Christensen, who was about 6'5", weighed about 280 pounds, claimed he played football for the University of Texas, but I don't know whether he really did. Anyway, we're standing there, and some ladies there with a microphone doing this kind of eulogy kind of thing. None of us had ever seen her before. None of us knew who she was. I go, "Ricky, who the hell's this broad with doing this long eulogy here, man? This eulogy's longer than JFK's. And Brett says, "Yeah, and he fucked Marilyn Monroe." It kind of gives you the feel for David's funeral. And I'll tell you, God bless David. I'm sure he floated up to heaven. I'm sure he's doing fine up there. I'm sure when he got to the pearly gates, he told St. Peter, hey man, I left my title back, my soul back on earth. I'll come back with it a week later, and scooted his way in, and now they can't kick him out. God bless you, David. We all miss you. Insane Sam out.